The day my mother's will was read. My brother already had his acceptance speech ready. He'd been rehearsing it for years, really. In the way he talked about when the bakeries, mine like. It was a foregone conclusion. The way he corrected suppliers who called him to ask about orders. The way he stood in the kitchen on Sunday mornings flipping through the books like he already owned them. So when the notary cleared his throat and said the bakery and everything tied to it would go to my brother. And that I would receive only the small house on Pemberton Street. He didn't even try to hide his smile. I'd spent the last 4 years of my mother's life inside that bakery and inside her illness in equal measure. And somehow I was the one walking out with a leaky-roofed house and nothing else, while he walked out with a business worth more than anything our family had ever owned. My name is Charlotte, and this is the story of the day everyone, including me, found out exactly how wrong they'd been about what mattered. I should tell you about the bakery first, because in our family, it was never just a bakery. My mother, Margaret, opened it in Kitchener 31 years ago with a second-hand oven and a recipe book that had belonged to her own mother. She called it Maple and Crumb, and over 3 decades it grew from a single storefront into something the whole neighborhood organized its mornings around. Smell of cinnamon buns drifting down the block before 7 a.m. The line out the door on Saturdays. The regulars who'd been coming since before I was born. By the time I was in my 20s, Maple and Crumb wasn't just a business. It was practically a local institution, the kind of place that got written up in the record every few years as a Kitchener Staples. My brother Theo went to work there right after he finished his business diploma at Conestoga College. It made sense on paper. He was good with numbers. Good with people when he wanted to be, and our mother had always seen something of herself in his ambition. I went a different way. I became a hairdresser, opened a tiny one-chair studio out of a rented space near Victoria Park, and built a small, steady clientele who trusted me with their color appointments and, more often than not, with whatever they were going through that week. It wasn't glamorous. It paid the bills, and it meant I had a flexible enough schedule that when things changed, I was the one who could change with them. Things changed 5 years before my mother died. She was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's, the kind that moves slowly at first and then doesn't. The tremors started small, a coffee cup rattling slightly in her hand, a signature on a delivery slip that didn't look quite like her anymore. Within 2 years, she needed help getting dressed some mornings. Within 3, she needed someone in the house almost constantly. Someone who understood her medication schedule, who could read the difference between a bad day and a dangerous one. Theo was, during all of this, extremely busy expanding the bakery. He opened a second location in Waterloo. He started doing wholesale accounts with 3 different grocery chains. He posted constantly on Instagram, photos of the new mixer he'd bought, captions about scaling the family legacy. A reel of him cutting a ribbon at the Waterloo opening, while our mother, who I'd had to help into the car that morning because her hands wouldn't cooperate with the buttons on her coat, stood off to the side in a folding chair someone had found for her. I moved into her house on Pemberton Street, 18 months before she passed. It was the house she'd raised us in. A narrow 2-story with a porch that sagged a little on one end, and a kitchen that still had the same yellow wallpaper from 1996. Theo called it the money pit. He wasn't wrong, exactly. The furnace was original. The upstairs bathroom hadn't been touched since the Mulroney years, and there was a damp patch in the basement that came back every spring no matter what we did to it. But it was where our mother wanted to be, and so it was where I was. I won't pretend those 18 months were noble or beautiful all the time. Because they weren't. There were nights I sat on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning because she'd fallen, and I couldn't get her up by myself. And didn't want to call an ambulance and frighten her. There were appointments I rescheduled with my own clients so many times that 2 of them quietly stopped booking with me. There was a stretch in the second winter where I didn't have a single day off for 11 weeks straight because the home care worker we'd hired quit and I hadn't found a replacement yet. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because it's the truth of what those years actually were. Underneath the version of the story everyone else told themselves. And the version everyone else told themselves was always about Theo. At Thanksgiving, my Aunt Diane would ask about the Waterloo location and how the wholesale accounts were going, and whether Theo had thought about a third store. At Christmas, my uncle would raise a glass to the future of Maple and Crumb, and nobody thought to mention that the woman whose name was on the lease was sitting at the end of the table in a wheelchair we'd had to rent, unable to lift the glass to toast along with everyone else. Nobody asked me how I was sleeping. Nobody asked who'd driven her to her neurology appointment in Toronto that took 4 hours round trip. I stopped expecting them to ask. Somewhere around year 3. It was easier that way. My mother died on a Tuesday morning in March, with the late winter light coming in thin through her bedroom curtains, and I was holding her hand when it happened. Theo was at the bakery. I called him, and he came, but by the time he arrived, it was already over, and I remember the strange numbness of watching him cry in the doorway of a room I'd spent 18 months learning every detail of, and feeling like a stranger had walked into my own grief. The funeral was at St. Andrews, and it was packed. That's how loved she was in this city. People got up one after another to talk about Maple and Crumb, about her recipes, about the legacy she was leaving behind through the business Theo's going to carry forward. Someone read a poem. Someone played a song she liked. Nobody mentioned the part where she couldn't hold a fork by the end, or the part where I'd learned to crush her pills into applesauce, because she could no longer swallow them whole. I sat in the second pew in a black dress that didn't quite fit anymore, because I'd lost weight that winter without meaning to, and I let the service happen around me like weather. The reading of the will was 8 days later, in a small conference room above a law office on King Street. My aunt and uncle were there. My cousin Priya, who I hadn't spoken to in over a year, was there too, sitting beside Theo like she already knew which side of the room to be on. Theo wore a suit. I hadn't even thought to dress up. I came straight from a haircut appointment, my hands still smelling faintly of developer. The notary, a calm older man named Mr. Bellwether, opened a folder and started reading through the preliminary clauses in the dry, procedural tone lawyers use for documents like this. And then he got to the part everyone was waiting for. Maple and Crumb Bakery, including both retail locations, all associated equipment, inventory, supplier contracts, and goodwill, shall pass in its entirety to Theodore Whitlock. Diane nodded like she'd already known. Theo exhaled slowly, the way you do when something you'd been hoping for finally lands. Priya squeezed his shoulder. Then Mr. Bellwether continued. The property at 14 Pemberton Street, including the house and the surrounding lot, shall pass in its entirety to Charlotte Whitlock. That was it. That was the whole division. A business worth, by Theo's own boasting over the years, somewhere north of $2 million, against a house with a leaking roof and a damp basement. The room did that thing rooms do. That low murmuring shuffle of people, pretending not to react while reacting completely. And Theo leaned back in his chair, and he laughed. Well, he said, loud enough that everyone could hear it. I guess Mom knew who could actually run something. A couple of relatives gave that uncomfortable half-smile people give when they don't want to be the one who objects. Theo didn't seem to notice or didn't care. He looked over at me, still smiling, and said, You spent 4 years playing nurse and you get a house that's falling apart. I spent 4 years building something, and I get an actual asset. A small ripple of laughter went through the room, the kind that's really just nervous energy looking for somewhere to go, and then he said the thing that made the room go completely silent. Maybe if you'd taken better care of her, she'd have lived long enough to leave you something worth having. I felt that sentence land somewhere under my ribs, a physical thing, like he'd reached across the table and pressed his hand flat against my chest. I opened my mouth to say something. I don't even know what. Some version of 4 years. Theo, 4 years, where were you? But before I could get a single word out, Mr. Bellwether closed the folder in front of him with a soft, deliberate click. He cleared his throat. Actually, he said, in the same even tone he'd used for everything else. There's one more matter your mother asked me to address after the primary terms were read. Every head in that room turned toward him at once. I felt my own pulse jump. Theo, still riding the high of his win, leaned forward with something close to amusement. What, did she leave me her recipe box too? A couple of people laughed again, that same nervous laugh. Mr. Bellwether didn't react to it at all. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second folder, older, softer at the corners, clearly handled many times before this morning. Your mother wrote a letter, he said. She was very specific that it be read aloud, after the will, in front of everyone present. I felt my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the house or the bakery. My mother was not a woman who wrote letters. In all my life, I'd maybe received 2 birthday cards from her, with more than her signature on them. If she'd sat down and written something meant to be read in this room, it mattered more than anything else that had happened in the last 20 minutes. Mr. Bellwether unfolded the pages carefully. Dear family, he began, and something about hearing her words in a stranger's voice made the whole room go very still in a different way than before. If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and before anyone starts deciding who got more and who got less, I'm asking you to actually listen. Theo built something real with the bakery, and I'm proud of that. He learned the business inside and out. He took risks I wouldn't have taken at his age, and the company belongs with someone who understands how to run it. That's him. I want to be clear about that, because what I'm about to say isn't about taking that away from him. He earned it. Theo nodded, visibly relaxing, like he'd been bracing for a punishment that wasn't coming. Then Mr. Bellwether turned the page, and his voice shifted slightly. But running a business and being a good son are 2 completely different things, and I learned that the hard way in the years when I needed someone, not someone's Instagram captions about legacy. The colors started draining slowly out of Theo's face. For 4 years, one of my children showed up. Not for events, not for ribbon cuttings. For the actual, unglamorous 3 a.m. work of keeping a person alive and feeling loved while her body fell apart around her. Charlotte never once asked me what she'd get out of it. She only ever asked if I needed anything. I felt my eyes go hot and full before I even understood I was crying. Across the table, my Aunt Diane was looking down at her hands. That's why I made sure she'd have something more important than a company, Mr. Bellwether read, and the room shifted. A kind of charged curiosity replacing the earlier tension. Mr. Bellwether set the letter down for a moment and picked up a separate document from his briefcase. 7 years ago, he explained, addressing the room now rather than just reading. Your mother quietly purchased the surface and subsurface rights tied to a parcel adjoining the Pemberton Street property, what used to be the old rail corridor land behind the house. Confused murmurs moved through the room. Theo frowned. What rights? That land's just an overgrown lot. It was, Mr. Bellwether agreed, until the city's transit expansion plan was approved last year. That corridor sits directly on the proposed route for the new Kitchener-Waterloo light rail extension. He let that settle for a second. Your mother was approached 14 months ago by the Regional Transit Authority with a formal land acquisition offer, along with a separate private offer from a development group interested in the adjacent lots for transit-oriented housing. The room went from murmuring to outright noise. My uncle actually said, out loud, "You're joking." "I'm not," Mr. Bellwether said simply. He slid a sheet of paper to the center of the table. The combined acquisition and development offers currently on record exceed $4.1 million. That land transfers automatically with the Pemberton Street property as specified in your mother's separate trust documentation, which predates this will by 6 years. I actually laughed. A startled, disbelieving sound, not because it was funny, but because my body didn't know what else to do with that much information landing at once. Theo's mouth opened and then closed. That can't be right, he finally managed. She never said anything about. She didn't say anything to anyone, Mr. Bellwether said, not unkindly. She asked me to handle it discreetly, specifically so that it wouldn't change how either of you treated each other before she passed. Then he reached for one more document, and his expression turned a degree more serious. There's an additional matter I'm required to disclose as part of the estate proceedings. He looked toward Theo. The bakery, as currently structured, carries 3 outstanding loans tied to the Waterloo expansion: equipment financing, a leasehold improvement loan, and a working capital line, totaling just under $900,000, along with 2 long-term wholesale contracts that include penalty clauses for early termination. Theo grabbed for the papers like he could will them into saying something different by reading them himself. I watched the confidence drain out of his face the way water drains from a tub, slow and then suddenly all at once. The business remains profitable on paper, Mr. Bellwether continued, but it carries significant debt and significant risk. The Pemberton Street property, by contrast, including the adjoining parcel, is held free and clear. No debt, no obligations. Only opportunity. He returned to the letter. If Charlotte ends up with more in the end, he read, it's because she understood something Theo never had to learn. People spend their whole lives chasing things that are worth money. Charlotte spent hers being worth something to a person who needed her. My throat closed up completely on that line. I wasn't even thinking about the land value anymore. I was thinking about 3 a.m. on the bathroom floor, about crushed pills in applesauce, about every single thing nobody at that funeral had thought to mention. She sat with me when there was nothing in it for her. Mr. Bellwether read, his voice softening on the final lines. So I'm trusting her with what comes next. Take care of each other. That's the only legacy that ever actually mattered to me. When he finished, nobody said anything for a long moment. Nobody looked at Theo. My Aunt Diane reached over and put her hand on top of mine, which was the first time in 5 years anyone in that family had touched me with anything other than obligation. Theo sat there with the loan documents still in his hands, staring at them like they might rearrange themselves into something easier to live with. He didn't apologize, not that day. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't the kind of story where everything gets wrapped up in a bow in the same afternoon it falls apart. But something in the room had shifted permanently, and everyone there knew it, including him. We talked, eventually, weeks later, over coffee at a place near the Waterloo store. He told me in a quieter voice than I'd heard from him in years that he'd spent so long trying to be the kind of son our mother could brag about that he'd missed every chance to actually be one. I didn't tell him it was fine. It wasn't entirely fine, but I told him I understood, because grief makes people reach for whatever role feels safest, and his had always been the one with a stage and an audience. I still live in the house on Pemberton Street. I fixed the roof first, and then the furnace, and I'm taking my time with the rest, because there's no rush anymore. Some mornings, I sit on that sagging porch with my coffee, and I think about how close I came to believing, for a few minutes in that conference room, that everything I'd given my mother had been worth less than a stand mixers and a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It wasn't. She knew it wasn't. And in the end, so did everyone else in that room, whether they wanted to or not.